say that a Mexican American is simply an American from Mexico, but that would ignore a very complex history and the mixing of cultures, not to mention the fact that in some families the Mexican was here long before the American ever showed up. And before there were Mexicans, there were subjects of the Crown of Spain. And earlier yet, there were indigenous tribes and civilizations. And before that, well, before that we'd have to go to northeastern Asia, to a time about 30,000 years ago, the Ice Age, when daily life focused on survival, which to these ancient Asians meant hunting the mammoth. Of course, the mammoth also wanted to survive and pushed further east to a place known today as the Bering Strait, 50 miles of ocean between the tip of Soviet Siberia and the edge of Alaska. But during that prehistoric time, the strait was a frozen, snow-covered land bridge, which the great herds and the Asian hunters crossed on foot, and perhaps without knowing it, discovered a new continent, America. For the next 20,000 years, the Asians trekked across the Bering Bridge, populating the lands which would become Canada, the United States, Mexico, Central and South America, clear to the tip of Tierra del Fuego. Even when the waters covered the land around 10,000 BC, the migration continued as the Asians became sailors, moving through the Aleutian Islands in small boats. At the same time, people were developing civilizations on the continent of Europe and Africa. During the several thousand years before the birth of Christ, there were among others the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, the Greeks, and of course the Roman Empire. By the 1st century AD in southern Europe, there developed a variety of fiefdoms known generally as Spain. In Romans 1524, St. Peter said he planned to visit Spain someday, but there's no confirmation that he ever did. But by the 4th century, Christianity had become the only tolerated religion in the area. But the next several centuries saw the region in chaos as the monarchs led armies through endless conquests and defeats, made alliances, usually followed by double crosses and more wars. The most significant of these were the military efforts of the Moors, Arab Muslims from the Sahara region of North Africa. In 756, under the leadership of Abdul Rahman I, the Moors succeeded in occupying and dominating significant portions of Spain. There were efforts to remove them, Charlemagne's army in 778 and the Norsemen in 844, but without success. The Moorish culture had its impact. Christians were obligated to conduct business in Arabic. Art, literature, and architecture were influenced. The region still consisted of a variety of warring kingdoms, some still controlled by Christians, but most, for the next 500 years, were dominated by the Arab Muslims. Meanwhile, in the Americas, civilization was moving right along. Fishing and farming were developed, as was commerce. Engineering and architecture were every bit as advanced as that in Europe. Mathematics and astronomy were quite sophisticated, as were the arts, athletics, music, and dance. Medicine was probably more advanced than in Europe. Bones were set, wounds were stitched, and archaeologists have evidence of Peruvians performing surgery to remove a brain tumor and having the patient survive. There were the Incas of Peru, the Mayans of Guatemala and the Yucatan, and the Aztecs of central and southern Mexico. There were, in fact, nearly 25 separate and distinct cultural groups on the American continent at various times before the arrival of the first European. Government usually took the form of tribal monarchies. The leader might have been known as the high priest, the emperor, or in one case, the great Inca. Others had specific responsibilities for teaching school or performing marriages. Wars were not uncommon, and among the Aztecs, the killing or capturing of 4 enemies entitled a young man to full citizenship. All of the cultures had religions based on the worship of multiple gods. The great pyramids of Mexico, Central and South America were in most cases built as temples, which, particularly among the Aztecs and Mayans, served as altars for human sacrifices. Sometimes enemy prisoners were so honored, sometimes young women, and in other cases citizens actually volunteered to be killed, an act believed to guarantee a happy afterlife. As gruesome as the idea may seem to us today, the total number of such deaths may not have been any larger than the number killed in the name of religion during the same period in Europe. Back in Europe, by the year 1238, in a series of wars, the Christians succeeded in toppling the various Arab kingdoms. Of course, many Spanish Arab families had been there for more than 500 years and had no place to go, so they were moved to an area called Granada, established as a Moorish kingdom, though under the control of the Castilians and heavily taxed. During the next 200 years, the region of Spain continued the old pattern of feudal leaders fighting wars and vying for power. Finally, in the 1470s, two of the Spanish kingdoms effected a merger of sorts. Queen Isabella of Castile married King Ferdinand of Aragon. They were quite an ambitious pair, determined to get rid of all the competing fiefdoms and unite Spain under a single crown, namely their own. To accomplish these ends, they employed one of the most commonly used tricks in history: create the illusion of danger from a common enemy, then use the accusation of disloyalty to get rid of any competing political factions. It was necessary to find a scapegoat or two, and like Adolf Hitler 450 years later, they found Spain's Jews to be convenient, as were the Moors in Granada. The Inquisition was on. Torture and death were applied to those not true enough to the Christian faith or loyal enough to the emerging unified Spain. Note that the Inquisition was not carried out by the Catholic Church, but by the Spanish crown. Some Catholics, including the Pope, raised objections, but apparently not enough to stop it. Spain was becoming a European power under a single crown that enjoyed a very special relationship with the hierarchy of the Church. The Spanish Muslims in Granada were soon attacked and defeated by Captain Gonzalo de Cordoba, whose development of infantry tactics made Spain unbeatable for the next 150 years. With the crown secure and political adversaries eliminated, the Inquisition for the time being came to an end. The final fait accompli was the expulsion from Spain of some 170,000 surviving Jews. The year was 1492. Hello, I'm Bill McCune, and during this program we're going to share with you the story of a people who are very important to our southwestern region: Hispanics, Mestizos, Latinos, Mexicans, Mexican-Americans, Chicanos. Many names have been used during 500 years of fascinating history and rich heritage. In many ways it is not a happy story. It often involves struggle and mistreatment, but it's also a legacy of courage and perseverance, and it's worthy of pride. It's our belief that this great history has often been ignored or misrepresented through negative stereotypes, and that's why we choose to call our examination of Arizona's Hispanic heritage Una Segunda Vista, a second look.
Perhaps one of the richest cultural gifts we have from Mexico is that of architecture. Mexican architecture is a unique blend. It's part Toltec and Mayan Indian, part Spanish. And the Spanish brought with them their own combination of Roman classicism and vivid Islamic imagery. With its sculpted, rounded forms, tile clay roofs, archways, and patios, it's a style that's at once welcoming and protective. This influence carries through to interior design as well, with the use of decorative tile, rustic furnishings, and color. It's given our habitats what some designers refer to as sensibilidad.
I remember as a child the school books presented Christopher Columbus as a brave explorer whom Isabel and Ferdinand sent to find the New World and bring home spices which apparently weren't available in Spain. I don't doubt his skills and bravery, but Christopher Columbus was a businessman, a risk-taking entrepreneur of the highest order. Perhaps the best analogy for his trip across the ocean is the person who today produces a high-budget motion picture with someone else's money. If it's a flop, you're all out of business. But if it's a hit, you all make a fortune. The adventure of Christopher Columbus was a big hit, and the biggest winner was Spain. In 1519, Hernan Cortez and an army of conquistadors landed on the American continent to conquer the Aztec nation and to establish New Spain. The warriors of Emperor Moctezuma II were no match for the Spaniards. By 1521, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, fell. Moctezuma was captured and later killed, ironically by his own people. On the site of the Aztec metropolis, the Spanish would establish a new capital, now called Mexico City. In Peru in 1532, Francisco Pizarro's army captured the great Inca, Atahualpa. His subjects offered the conquistadors gold for his freedom. They accepted the ransom, then executed the last Inca monarch. The Mayans held out the longest. The army of Francisco de Montejo attacked their Guatemalan domain in 1526, but it took nearly 20 years to get control of the Mayans' northern reaches in the Yucatan Peninsula. The conquistadors imported to New Spain from Europe many cultural luxuries and amenities to supplement the wealth taken from the Indian civilizations. Despite some setbacks, people like Cortez ultimately became wealthy.
He had a 20% cut that he was entitled to. Now, how much of that he got at that moment, I can't say, because what eventually happened is that much of the wealth that they obtained, they lost on what they called the Noche Triste, the night of June the 30th, July the 1st of 1520. Later, he was handsomely rewarded by the king.
Wary of the natives' traditions, the Spanish ordered the burning of the codices, precious Indian language manuscripts telling the history of the Aztecs and the Mayans. By the mid-1530s, the colony was taking shape. The reins of government were in the hands of a viceroy who administered the king's rules known as the Law of the Indies. Spanish settlers flocked in. To certain favored families, the crown granted encomiendas, the title to large estates and the privilege of forcing labor from the Indians who already lived there. As time went on, many Indians became free wage earners employed by large haciendas. But low pay was taken in the form of food and shelter, and workers typically found themselves hopelessly in debt. Virtually everyone holding a high administrative post in government was born in Spain. They were known as peninsulars. Criollos, persons of Spanish descent but born in the New World, could usually hold only mid-level or lower posts. The mestizos, those born with mixed Spanish, Indian, and sometimes African blood, had a very difficult time moving up the ladder. The propagation of Christianity became an important part of life in New Spain. Roman Catholicism was the only religion permitted. Efforts to Christianize the Indians began in 1522. Early conversions were sometimes superficial. But the fortunes of the church improved in 1531 when an Indian peasant from Guadalupe reported the appearance of the Virgin Mary. As word of Our Lady of Guadalupe spread, the task of Christianizing native Indians became easier. The church played important early roles. It had exclusive control over education and culture. In 1553, in Mexico City, it established the Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, the oldest university in the Western Hemisphere. The clergy also undertook efforts in the study of Indian antiquities, natural phenomenon, and promoted painting and architecture, often mixing Spanish designs with Aztec, Inca, and Mayan styles to produce ornate churches.
Of course, the priests were virtually all European-born, a reality throughout the colonial period. Ultimately, the church grew to have one archbishop, 8 bishops, 1,703 parishes, and operated 254 convents. It also enjoyed immense power through its right of censorship over intellectual and political thought.
It may seem strange today, but the people of New Spain 400 years ago really didn't know much about what lay north of them. Some thought it was China, or India, or a great waterway.
A place they called Gran Quivera, they called Cibola. They were interested in exploring it. They also believed that there was a water passageway, a strait, if you will. They were so certain of its existence that they even named it before they located it, called it the Strait of Añan. They spent a great deal of time looking for it, and of course they didn't find it because it just doesn't exist. Didn't exist then, it doesn't exist now.
Keep in mind that it would be almost 250 years before they made any serious effort to settle and colonize the northern frontier, including modern-day Sonora, Arizona, California, and beyond. There were, of course, expeditions that laid the groundwork for later efforts. As early as 1528, Cabeza de Vaca was shipwrecked on the east coast of Texas and spent 8 years wandering the southwest. His fantastic stories led Father Marcos de Niza to authorize a search for the 7 golden cities of Cibola. The expedition was led by Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. They never found the gold, but the Coronado Trail introduced them to a lot of new territory. Around the same period, people like Nuño de Guzman conquered Jalisco and other Pacific coastal regions. And in 1610, Juan de Onate founded Santa Fe, New Mexico, several years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. And there was Father Eusebio Francisco Kino, an Italian Jesuit, who at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th centuries traveled throughout the Southwest, laying the groundwork for a system of missions. Among Kino's seed work was San Javier del Bac around 1700, although the landmark building wasn't begun until the 1780s. The clergy had a 50-year presence among the Hopi in northeastern Arizona until those people revolted in 1680. In the mid-1700s, there were outcroppings of settlers and priests in the Santa Cruz Valley, but conflicts arose leading in 1751 to a revolt by local Pima Indians. The result was the death of more than 100 farmers and miners, as well as 2 Jesuits. In reaction, a presidio was established at Tubac, making it in 1752 the first permanent Spanish settlement in Arizona. One of Tubac's early commanders was Juan Bautista de Anza, who later would lead the very first expeditions to found Monterey and San Francisco, California. The city we know as Tucson was first an Indian village called Tucson. Over the years, the Spanish gave it various names. Kino called it San Cosme. Later, it was San Jose. Then it became San Agustin del Tucson. That's what it was in 1775 when Father Francisco Garces and an Irish expatriate named Hugo O'Connor marked out the site of the new presidio across the Santa Cruz River from the Indian village. 1767 saw the beginning of the movement into Pimeria Alta, modern-day southern Arizona and Sonora, to Nuevo Mexico, New Mexico, and to Alta California, the Pacific Coast region. This settlement of the northern frontier brought into focus certain problems for those people of mixed Indian and Spanish blood, the ancestors of most modern-day Mexicans and Mexican Americans. There had been a strict social pecking order, Spanish-born and Spanish heritage on the top, mixed blood next, the Indians last.
The more pure you were of Spanish blood, the better you were, to the degree that if you had been born in Spain and your brother was born in America, just because you had been born in Spain, you were peninsular as compared to being a native-born American, a Creole, and you were thus superior to him and he was inferior to you, as if the very air that they breathed here was inferior.
Kind of interesting, if you were born in Spain, your parents were born in Spain, then you were of the high class, but if you happened to marry then somebody who maybe was born in Mexico or New Spain, this puts you at a lower level. So you had to be very careful who you married, and your children would suffer the consequences.
The church had a slightly different set of priorities. Certainly Spanish-born and criollos were at the top, but particularly on the northern frontier, the dominant Franciscans saw their primary responsibility as Christianizing and civilizing the pure-blooded Indians. This put the mestizos at the bottom of the ladder. It's important to understand that establishing church missions, government communities, and military presidios were 3 separate operations. Indeed, they were often coordinated, but just as often the interaction brought conflicts, many times with racial overtones. For example, in the mid-1770s, influential Father Junipero Serra vehemently opposed the government's plan to utilize what he viewed as unsuitable mixed-blood settlers to establish communities in Alta California. Despite the objections, strong-minded Governor Felipe de Neve went on to establish San Jose, California in 1777 and the Pueblo de Los Angeles in 1781.
Later, one historian, obviously sharing the prejudice against mixed bloods, wrote that the first mestizo settlers of Los Angeles were, in his words, mongrel racial types and by all accounts a dissolute, immoral, gambling, lazy lot, end quote.
One of the most ancient cuisines of the Western world, Mexican food, has become so popular here in the Southwest that ingredients previously thought of as exotic, like tomatillos, avocado, jicama, pinto beans, even a variety of chili peppers, are now common in most supermarkets. And just as a Corona beer can be found in most any bar, a Mexican restaurant is found on nearly every street corner. Though some might think all Mexican food is hot and spicy, many foods taken for granted today originated in Mexico, corn being one of them. And this Mexican invention, the tortilla, is one of the most versatile foods today. Picture a crispy taco, a melt-in-your-mouth chimichanga, or a tender chicken enchilada. Got you hungry? You can thank your Mexican neighbors.
We've heard a lot about Spanish land grants. These were awarded for the development of livestock and agricultural operations called rancheros as part of New Spain's northern expansion. The Franciscans in the region disliked the concept, preferring settlement adjacent to their missions on land that they controlled.
Perhaps it was a political compromise that these Franciscans were given a virtual veto over the individual land grants. Many applicants of mixed blood were men retiring from service in the Spanish Army. Most such requests were vetoed. During the first 30 years of the land grant system, only 24 mixed-blooded applicants were approved, and all of these were married to neophytes, pure-blooded Indian women who had been raised and educated in the church's convent system. There was also a history of friction between the hierarchy of the church and the military. The friars sometimes refused to minister to the presidios, manned by soldiers of mixed blood. A military governor wrote angrily to Father President Serra, quote, "May God forgive your reverence for the Christian doctrine which the children at the presidio are not learning, and for the education they are not receiving." By 1808, after 289 years of colonial rule, New Spain had a population of 6 million people. It had a sophisticated infrastructure, particularly around a very cultured Mexico City, and it had a complex government, headed by the Viceroy, run by Spanish-born executives, but in most ways controlled by the King of Spain, and very much influenced by the hierarchy of the clergy. The life of the elite class was indeed comfortable.
There was a lot of native labor there to do it for you, and these people were not used to really working hard. The ricos, or the rich class, they were a lot of young men who just didn't believe in working. They just came over to get seek their fortunes.
As for the church itself, a rigid system of fees for baptisms, marriages, and funerals, as well as gifts from the king and upper-class laymen, made it wealthy, owning half of the real estate and capital in the country. The clergy enjoyed numerous legal privileges. They were subject only to church courts, which also had jurisdiction over many civil matters. As its wealth and power increased, its diligence declined. Educational efforts were drastically reduced. 90% of the population remained totally illiterate. But here it's important to observe that within the clergy, there were some liberal reform-minded thinkers who had been very much influenced by the American Revolution. Admittedly, they were at the low echelons of the church, among the parish priests, but their views would find a following, and their influence would be felt. In 1808, the French leader Napoleon successfully invaded Spain with the intention of making his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the new king. In Mexico City, some criollos saw a window of opportunity. They demanded independence and an end to exclusive privilege for the Spanish-born. In reality, they wanted to replace the Peninsulars with a new criollo ruling class, while keeping everything else the same. They were quickly arrested and jailed, but the independence movement burst into flames 2 years later with a proclamation from a liberal parish priest, Miguel Hidalgo, from the village of Dolores. Hidalgo's speech is known as the Cry of Dolores, and in it he outlined what must have seemed outrageous demands: an end to peninsular rule, an end to all the church hierarchy's privileges, a redistribution of the land of large estates. The Cry of Dolores marked the start of an armed conflict supported by the people of mixed blood and the Indians. Had the Criollos joined the cause, it might have been decisive, but they concluded that Hidalgo's reforms were too radical for them and sided instead with the ruling elite. So the armed conflict became not only a revolution against Spain, but a civil war with the nation's upper class, including the Spanish-born church hierarchy, against its poorer masses. That scenario set the stage for the next 110 years of Mexican history. The Cry of Dolores was issued in 1810 on the 16th of September, the date that is still celebrated as Mexican Independence Day. Hidalgo's ragtag army won several battles, but within a few months he and his top lieutenants were captured and put to death. The cause was then taken up by Father Jose Maria Morales, who proved to be a brilliant military commander. While enjoying numerous military victories, his followers also issued a Declaration of Independence and drafted a constitution for representative government. By 1814, it looked as if success was near when there came an unexpected twist. In Spain, the Spanish succeeded in throwing out the French invaders. That, of course, freed up the military to go to Mexico. Within a year, Father Morales, his army defeated, was captured, defrocked, and executed. The battle was then taken up by Vicente Guerrero, whose army was little more than a few bands of guerrillas. The cause looked bleak when suddenly there was another unlikely twist. In Spain, in 1820, a revolutionary movement brought a more liberal government to power. Suddenly it appeared that the mother country, Spain, was adopting the same radical reforms advocated by the Mexican revolutionaries. In Mexico City, the ruling class feared an end to its privileged life. It had to act fast, and there was developed an ingenious plan to protect its interest. Agustin de Iturbide, a wealthy landowner and former military officer, convinced the unsuspecting viceroy that if he just had an army at his disposal, he could find and defeat Guerrero's rebel forces. Liberal reforms may be coming from Spain, the argument probably went, but such radical revolutionaries should be eliminated anyway. The viceroy must have agreed, but Iturbide was no sooner given his army than he turned it against the viceroy and proclaimed the Plan of Iguala.
Under that plan, Mexico was to be independent of Spain. It would have its own monarchy. The church would retain all of its powers, Criollos and Peninsulars would be equal, and there would be no redistribution of land. It was one of the greatest double crosses of all times. The government in Spain must have concluded that after 300 years of profitable occupation, the Mexican colony wasn't worth fighting to keep. In August 1821, the viceroy, on behalf of the Spanish crown, accepted Mexican independence. For the poor and uneducated, the peons of mixed blood, and the Indians, it must have seemed like little, if any, change at all.
With Iturbide's leadership, a new government was formed and a Congress elected. But unaccustomed to the bickering of the legislative process, he became frustrated and decided to cut through the confusion. He declared himself the Emperor of Mexico. The lack of success in representative democracy was due largely to a lack of experience.
There was strict control and administration by the Spaniards politically, because what the Spaniards did was to come up with what they called the Royal and Supreme Council of the Indies. And for hundreds of years, all that body did was to legislate and to make rules. The people of New Spain didn't have to govern, didn't have an opportunity to govern. Somebody was doing it for them and doing it in a very detailed fashion in Spain. No self-government here, so afterwards they failed because they had had no prior practice.
Several months later, lacking the support of the military, Iturbide was forced into exile. When he tried to regain power in 1822, he was arrested and shot. The Congress, meanwhile, had declared the Republic of Mexico. But the international community viewed this new country with doubt. All three of its population groups were vilified. The Indians, receiving no recognition for their earlier Mayan, Inca, or Aztec empires, were often viewed as savages. The mestizos, those of mixed blood, suffered the sting of racial stereotyping. In 1824, American Edward Taylor wrote that they were ignorant, incapable of governing themselves, and had no virtues whatsoever. Even the Spanish heritage of the upper class was targeted. Its religion was viewed by European and American Protestants as something evil. A common prayer was that these Roman Catholics would be converted away from Satan. And then there was the Black Legend. That was a view fostered by some early Northern European historians that virtually everything of and about Spain was wicked. They were painted as cruel, greedy, and treacherous. The Spanish Inquisition was often cited as a good example. In many ways, Spain's bad behavior wasn't much worse than that of its critics. But the Black Legend provided convenient fuel for bigotry, even against Mexican descendants hundreds of years later. It would not be inaccurate nor unfair to describe the first 25 years of Mexico's history as political chaos. It was a constant struggle with conservatives, believers in authoritarian rule, which is all they'd known for 300 years, competing against liberals, advocates of constitutional democracy, with which they had no experience at all. A quick rundown of the period goes as follows. Guadalupe Victoria, a liberal, was elected president in 1824 and had the rare distinction of serving a full 4-year term. The conservatives won in 1828, but before they could take office, the liberals seized power and installed as president Vicente Guerrero, the former revolutionary. After a year, he was overthrown by conservative General Anastasio Bustamante, who held power for 3 years until 1832, before being ousted by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, siding with the liberals. Santa Anna soon resigned in favor of liberal Gomez Farias, who sought to reduce the power of the clergy. Santa Anna then switched sides and rescued the clergy by toppling Farias. Then he effectively tossed out the Constitution and assumed dictatorial powers. At that point, up in the Mexican state called Texas, settlers of American descent objected to the loss of their rights under the Mexican Constitution, and in 1836 declared their independence. Donning his military uniform, Santa Anna fought the Texans and enjoyed a complete victory at the Alamo.
It would be a very short time later, however, that Santa Anna would suffer a decisive defeat at San Jacinto. It would cost him his job, and it created a new separate country, the Republic of Texas.
With 1 out of every 5 Arizonans being Hispanic, it's no wonder Espanol continues to have a strong influence on our culture. Spanish words are everywhere you look. Geographic names like Mesa, Ajo, Casa Grande, Rio Salado, or plant names like Ocotillo, Saguaro, Palo Verde. Other common expressions include macho or adios. This free-form blend of Spanish and English is a part of our daily life. Sometimes, though, the resulting words are quite comical. For example, vaquero, meaning cowboy, somehow became buckaroo. And here's an embarrassing one. According to Time magazine, a Braniff Airlines ad that sought to tell Spanish-speaking audiences they could settle back en, meaning in, luxuriant cuero, meaning leather seats, inadvertently said they could fly without clothes, and cuero. Oops, or should I say, hijuela.
Around 1837, a new centrist constitution was adopted, and Anastasio Bustamante was back in as president, at least for a few years, until 1841, when once again the irrepressible Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna seized power.
General Santana was a real piece of work. He's interesting. He's not really honored in Mexico today, very little. He was, yet during his time, I believe he was presidente dictator 11 different times in his career. He had amazing ability to read the signs. He knew when to change parties. He knew when to appear on stage.
He fancied himself a great military leader. And the truth is that he went so far as to call himself the Napoleon of the West. But in spite of the fact that he had numerous opportunities to practice his military skills, he was never more than mediocre.
Santana was a politician, and he was, anything was for sale with Santana, including Mexico.
Santa Anna had a bad habit of spending the treasury dry. Faced with not being paid, the military revolted and brought in a moderate president, Jose Joaquin Herrera. After serving for 2 years, however, Herrera was viewed as being a bit too friendly with the Americans, and in 1846 was overthrown by the conservatives and President Mariano Paredes. During the same quarter century, a lot of changes took place on the northern frontier, and most of it not for the better. As a practical matter, the Republic of Mexico could not afford the luxury of protecting and developing the region. The military presence was drastically reduced, and the Spanish government's practice of paying the Apaches to stay peaceful was ended. Bands of hostile Indians began raiding on a regular basis, and hundreds of Mexican families left the area. Rancheros and mines were abandoned. Rich farms along the Santa Cruz River were left to the forces of erosion. The Presidio at Tubac was virtually unmanned, and most of its residents moved to Tucson. And in Tucson, with a population of about 450, its first mayor, Jose de Leon, wrote to the government that if they were not going to get ample military protection, they shouldn't have to pay taxes for an army. A later Tucson mayor, Francisco Ortega, organized a local militia made up of 28 settlers and 38 friendly Indians. On more than one occasion, such home guards fought valiantly against tribal war parties. There were other changes also. In 1827, the Mexican government deported en masse all persons who had been born in Spain, including all the priests in what is now Arizona. There were domestic political squabbles as well. The first Mexican Constitution of 1824 combined the states of Sonora and Sonora into a single state of Occidente. Nobody in the North seemed to like the idea. Another point of contention was that Hermosillo had been named the state capital, while a great many residents favored the town of Arizpe. In 1832, they finally got a separate state of Sonora, with Arizpe the capital. But it didn't matter for long. In 1835, the conservative national government issued a decree eliminating the sovereign states and replacing them with federal departments. The state legislatures each had to appoint a 6-man governing junta, then vote themselves out of existence. It had been that edict that had caused the Texans to break away from Mexico. And 10 years later, in 1846, it would be Texas, having recently joined the United States, that would be the catalyst for the Mexican-American War. President James Polk had been trying to persuade Mexico to sell California and to settle a disagreement over the location of the international border south of Texas. Along the disputed boundary, both countries sent military patrols, which inevitably clashed, and the war was on. Capturing Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California took little effort. Then attention was turned southward. In Mexico, the Liberals were back in and ironically hired General Santa Anna to command the army. He moved his troops north and was defeated at the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847. American General Winfield Scott captured Veracruz. Santa Anna regrouped his forces but suffered more defeats at Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Chapultepec, and Churubusco. Finally, in September 1847, Winfield Scott captured Mexico City. The war was over. There was negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave to the United States all of the territory north of the Rio Grande and Gila rivers from El Paso to the Pacific Ocean. In return, Mexico was paid $15 million in cash and another $3 million in credits. It was not long, however, before the Americans wanted another look at the deal they'd made. Among other things, the Yankees realized that the most practical route for a railroad to the Pacific was along the 32nd parallel, which was still in Mexico. So in 1854, there was ratified another treaty known as the Gadsden Purchase, in which, for $10 million, the U.S. bought the land from the Gila River to the present-day Mexican border. And that area, of course, included the town of Tucson and the areas that would become Yuma, Bisbee, and Douglas.
It would be March 10, 1856, that the last company of Mexican troops in Tucson lowered their flag and marched south. Despite an agreement that the U.S. flag was not to be raised until the Mexicans had left the city, a few newly arrived gringos did so anyway and taunted the column. This seemingly insignificant incident speaks volumes about some Americans' lack of knowledge and lack of sensitivity toward their southern neighbor.
The Mexicans who lived in the Gadsden Purchase area had to make a difficult decision between moving south with their countrymen or staying to become the first by choice Mexican Americans. They were not transients nor interlopers. Many of the families, Romero, Ramirez, De Leon, Barragan, had worked the land, suffered the hardships, and defended against Indian raids for more than 100 years. To give it all up would be painful. To stay would bring the uncertainty of adopting a new country dominated by an Anglo culture and a potpourri of citizens who had demonstrated little appreciation of their Hispanic heritage. It was not much of a welcome from a new country, but many stayed and helped in the development of new communities. It is reasonable to say that the first 25 years of Mexican-American history in Arizona, from 1853 to 1877, saw race relations that were relatively better than what would come later. And there are understandable reasons. The population, both Anglo and Hispanic, was small. Those with Mexican roots outnumbered the Anglos. There was a well-established cultural base, identifiable community leadership, civic participation, and some long-standing businesses, especially in Tucson. And perhaps most important, they were all in the same boat. They shared the ongoing danger of hostile Apaches and the ongoing frustration of struggling to convince the government to make Arizona a territory of the United States. Congress had rejected such proposals at least 10 times, so in 1860, a group of prominent Mexican Americans, including such names as Ochoa, Aguirre, Chavez, and Garcia, joined with some equally prominent Anglos, held a convention, wrote a constitution, and declared this the provisional territory of Arizona. Nobody in Washington took it very seriously, but it made the point that these rugged frontier people viewed themselves as Americans and wanted to be recognized as such. In a sense, the effort was too little too soon, for about a year later, in February 1862, with the Civil War raging, the Confederate Army marched into Tucson and proclaimed the Confederate territory of Arizona. Given that the American Army had been ordered east, which left the Tucsonans at the mercy of the Apaches, most folks were probably glad to have any army back in town, except for one detail. All citizens had a choice: pledge allegiance to the Confederacy or mount up that day and ride out of town, right through Apache country. Most of the men took the pledge. Some meant it, some didn't, but a number of Mexican Americans in particular refused to turn their back on their new country. A case in point is Esteban Ochoa, one of Tucson's most prominent citizens. As the owner of a successful freighting company, he had considerable wealth and property, all of which he left behind as he got on a horse and took the dangerous road to the south. Of course, Mexico was at the time engaged in its own civil war. The liberals had achieved a victory of sorts and installed one of that country's greatest presidents, Benito Juarez.
Benito Juarez was Mexico's best and most able president. What Benito Juarez demonstrated was a perseverance, a dogged determination to see through his course of action to achieve his goals and to preserve the integrity and the independence of Mexico. And in many respects, he was like Abraham Lincoln, and in fact, he was a contemporary and a colleague of Lincoln in that they understood each other's problems and they did communicate.
But the exiled conservatives then convinced Napoleon III to join their cause. The French army invaded Mexico in 1862 and was initially defeated at Puebla on the 5th of May. The Cinco de Mayo is celebrated still as a national holiday. Ultimately, however, the French captured Mexico City and installed Maximilian of Habsburg, an Austrian prince, and actually a fairly moderate fellow, as Emperor of Mexico in 1864. In the meantime, back in Arizona, the The American Army won a small victory at the Battle of Picacho Peak. The Confederates decided it was time to leave Tucson, which allowed Union Army General James Carleton to march in and, without consulting the Congress, declare the establishment of the United States Territory of Arizona. Nobody objected. The Mexican Americans who had chosen exile over disloyalty returned to Tucson. Esteban Ochoa went on to serve 3 terms in the territorial legislature, where he helped to establish Arizona's education system. He personally donated the land for the state's very first public school, served as president of the Tucson School Board, and rounded out his political career as the mayor of that city in 1875. And we should add this. Back in Mexico, the French Army had gained absolute control over every major city. When the American Civil War ended in 1865, the U.S. government strongly suggested to the French that they should go home, or else the large Union Army might come down and throw them out. The French left. President Benito Juarez regained power and served well for several terms. The otherwise well-meaning but hapless Maximilian was executed for war crimes he had allowed the French army to commit.
During the war in Mexico, the San Patricio, or St. Patrick's Brigade, was made up of Irish-American immigrants. Lonely and away from home, they began to make friends with Mexican villagers who, like them, were Catholics. They got along so well that the San Patricio Brigade took their artillery and fought the rest of the war on the side of Mexico. When the Americans won, most of these Irishmen were convicted of treason and hanged. Others got away, and today you can find Kellys and O'Briens in Mexico, where the memory of the San Patricio Brigade is honored.
The Aztec Indians of ancient Mexico used to woo their gods with music and dance, and the custom continues. Whenever there's a fiesta or celebration in Arizona, you're bound to find a colorful display of Mexican folk dances. They're performed by groups such as Ballet Folklorico, helping to keep alive a beautiful tradition.
The good news was that Jose Maria Redondo of Yuma was overwhelmingly elected to the first Arizona Territorial House of Representatives in 1864. The bad news was that he couldn't take office. He'd forgotten to file the papers to become a U.S. citizen. Later, he did serve several terms in the legislature and was the mayor of Yuma.
Mariano Guadalupe Samanigo came to Tucson in 1864, having graduated from St. Louis University. He built successful cattle and freighting businesses, served 4 terms in the legislature, and was an early advocate of a state university. Later, Samanigo was one of the first members of the university's Board of Regents. We've mentioned Arizona's first public school in Tucson. One of the first teachers there was Mary Bernard Aguirre, an Anglo whose Hispanic husband, Epifanio, was a respected southern Arizona businessman who was killed in an Apache ambush. The Aguirre family is still very active in the state. Another early Tucson teacher was Ignacio Bonillas, a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Bonillas returned to his native country, but later became the Mexican ambassador to the United States. One of Bonillas' students had been Carlos Jacome, who in the 1890s established a dry goods store and became one of Tucson's leading merchants and a promoter of the arts. Later in 1910, Carlos Jacome was a member of the Arizona Constitutional Convention. And there was the Elias family, which was prominent in the region for a century or more, producing a president of Mexico and 2 state governors. In Mexico, the family had held vast interests which in large part were operated by Eulalia Elias, certainly one of the first women business executives. Later in Arizona, the family continued its political tradition, with Jesus and Juan Elias each serving 2 terms in the territorial legislature. In general, there had been a reasonable level of participation and tolerance between the Anglo and Mexican-American communities. Then in a fairly sudden way, that seemed to deteriorate. For example, in most elections there had been 3 or 4 Mexican Americans sent to the legislature. But after the session of 1877, the trend changed. During the rest of the territorial period, there would be no more than 1 Mexican American legislator in each of 5 sessions, and none selected in 11 other elections. There are a variety of explanations. The railroad began to destroy the freighting business, the economic base of some prominent Hispanics. As towns became more secure from Indian attack, there was less mutual dependence between the races. But perhaps the most important factor was that Mexican Americans had for the first time become a numerical minority. And some of the population influx came from southern and border states, including Confederate veterans with racially prejudiced attitudes. Mining was becoming important, and the cities in the south and eastern part of the state grew with significant Mexican American populations. Many had long histories with mining in the area, and adverse conditions brought out the strength of the family.
It was isolation and it was stability. And it was indeed adversity in the fact that one was fighting constantly for economic benefits, for social justice, that brought not only the family together, but brought all of us together, created a very close community.
They had developed effective techniques and extracting methods unknown to the Eastern entrepreneurs they worked for. Sharing that knowledge brought little benefit or reward. W. Clement Easton, an observer in the 1880s, wrote that the mines were worked by the Mexican poor class who were treated no better than slaves in the South. A common practice was to pay Mexican and Mexican American miners about half the wage paid to Anglos doing the same job. The logical action would be to form a union, and labor organizing was something most Mexican immigrants were familiar with. In Mexico, the labor movement had started in the 1870s. The first miners' union in Arizona came in 1896 in Globe, the Western Federation of Miners. But it did Hispanics little good, as its membership was exclusively Anglo. In fact, the WFM's rallying cry was, quote, "to all those wishing to keep Globe a white man's town," end quote.
There was frustration, but many times the law enforcement, the cops, were agents of the company. So they couldn't do very much, because if Jordan or the sheriff knocked on your door, then you had to leave in the middle of the night, because the company had the police power to get people out. There was frustration, but yet the unity of living together, of belonging to social organizations that kept them together, kind of mitigated the circumstances at work.
Other groups of immigrants were also treated poorly, particularly Central Europeans, such as Italians, Slavs, and Romanians. These elements joined forces with Mexican Americans in 1903 for what became known as the Mexican Affair. Under the leadership of Abran Salcido, that mixed group called a strike in Clifton and Morenci and shut down the mines. The Western Federation of Miners offered no support. If the strikers had determination, the mine management had other tools, including the sheriff, the Arizona Rangers, and the National Guard. There were a few violent confrontations, and the strike was broken. But the damage went beyond the labor dispute. Passionate editorials in Anglo newspapers added to the growing anti-Mexican feeling in the territory. There was developing among Mexican American leaders a concern about the spread of bigotry and conditions generally. Began to form such organizations as Alianza Hispano-Americana, the Alliance of Hispanic Americans.
They were primarily organized to improve the position of the Mexican along the border area, but then of course they became a mutual, what we call the Mutualista, which was an organization, a fraternal organization, comprised of members whose goal was to improve the lot of the Mexican. And then later the Alianza became involved in combating racism for the Mexican and even on behalf of the Mexican miner.
Aside from the search for opportunity, Mexican immigration to the United States ebbed and flowed with conditions in Mexico. The 33-year reign of dictator Porfirio Diaz offers an example. Rural Mexicans especially received little consideration of their human rights. Minor civil and criminal disputes were sometimes resolved by his police force, the Rurales, who held firing squads first and asked questions later.
In Clifton, Arizona in 1904, at the urging of their parish priest, nearly 40 Mexican-American families agreed to adopt orphaned babies from a New York foundling hospital. Each family paid equal to a month's wages in fees and expenses for their new baby's transportation. When local Anglo citizens saw white babies being distributed to Mexican mothers, they were outraged. A vigilante committee went house to house retrieving the babies at gunpoint and gave them to Anglo citizens. A year later, perhaps predictably, the Territorial Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Anglo foster parents. Of course, the state of the economy affected jobs. When times got tough in the early days, Mexican Americans were sometimes threatened and encouraged to leave. This happened on a large scale during the Depression of the 1930s.
As the economy worsened, as the Depression worsened, then the deportations increased, and many Mexicans were illegally deported. Those who were U.S. citizens, they were naturalized, they were individuals who had children born in the United States, but many were, of course, deported illegally with the help of the Red Cross and social welfare agencies as well.
In 1909, anti-Mexican-American feelings in Arizona took on a new dimension. It was legalized. The territorial legislature, controlled by Democrats, enacted a law that registered voters had to be literate in English. It was believed by the Democrats that Mexican-Americans tended to vote Republican. Governor Joseph Kibbe, a Republican activist for civil rights, objected, but they overrode his veto. Later in October 1910, the official convention was held to draft the proposed Arizona state constitution. Those deliberations included blatantly anti-Hispanic proposals, which were supported by the Old South-oriented Democratic Party and the all-white labor unions. The measure would have prohibited non-citizens from jobs on any public works project, such as building a road or a bridge. Even many Hispanics who were American citizens would have a hard time proving it, as birth records were not always well kept. The proposal became Article 18, Section 10 of the state constitution, and it still is. And so, on February 14, 1912, Arizona became the 48th state, a time of celebration and hope. Those who immigrated came with a fundamental understanding of the promise of America, and a belief that that promise, even if not yet fulfilled, was a better bet than the uncertainty of a Mexico that couldn't seem to get a grip on its democratic institutions.
The Mexicans were also coming north from Mexico to seek opportunity, to seek work, and also to become Americans. And so the government in Mexico couldn't fill the needs of the Mexican. There was land being taken away, people were being uprooted, the economy was not good, and so people had to flee for political purposes and for economic purposes. And so they came to the United States.
Even as statehood became a reality, the cannons of civil war were again being heard across the border. The army of democratic reformer Francisco Madero forced Porfirio Diaz into exile. But then Madero was assassinated and replaced by dictator Victoriano Huerta. The fighting resumed, and in mid-1914, Huerta fled. Then the war continued in a kind of playoff round between four revolutionary leaders, Generals Carranza and Obregon, somewhat against Villa and Zapata, to see who would end up in power. When President Woodrow Wilson supported the constitutionalist Carranza, Pancho Villa attacked the United States in retribution, killing 17 people, including some women and children, at Columbus, New Mexico. In response, a force led by American General John J. Pershing spent the next few years chasing Villa around the Sonoran Desert, but they never caught him. The former bandit leader eventually made his peace and went into retirement. A decade later, he was rather unceremoniously assassinated. Zapata, whose primary interest had been land reform, was killed in 1918. Actually, by 1915, Carranza had control of most of the country and became president, but enjoyed only limited success in his reforms. Carranza, too, was overthrown in 1920 by his old ally Obregon, but it was a different sort of overthrow, no large battles, more of a forced retirement in which Carranza committed suicide with 5 bullets in the head. In the 1920s, Obregon also would be assassinated. There would be a military flare-up from time to time, but for the most part, Mexico's 110 years of bloody revolutions came to an end.
Mexico has always had a strong heritage of music and song. Spanish invaders brought with them one innovation the Mexicans adopted wholeheartedly, the guitar. It's the #1 instrument in Mexico and the basic accompaniment for the mariachi. It was during the French occupation of the 1860s that horns were introduced. In fact, the term mariachi was coined from the French word mariage, or marriage, when a French nobleman hired a Mexican band for an important wedding.
In Arizona, the 20th century was in full swing, and Mexican Americans were engaged in a bittersweet experience, perhaps more bitter than sweet. They participated in the nation's institutions. During World War I, thousands of Hispanics served with distinction in America's armed forces. By the 1930s, hostile Apaches had been quelled for nearly 50 years, and the ties with Mexico had been broken for 3/4 of a century. The earmarks of modern industrial America were imprinting the Arizona landscape, and Eastern tourists were discovering the recreation and therapeutic value of the Sonoran Desert. In the mind of Anglo-Arizona, the Mexican-American presence may have added to the flavor and charm of the region, but was mostly invited to stay out of sight. And the methods of enforcement took many forms. Housing patterns are an obvious example, as Adam Diaz, who later served on the Phoenix City Council, remembers.
North of Van Buren was impossible to buy anything for us because of the fact that there was a deed restriction. All deeds had a restriction, and as I say, as a matter of fact, our experience was that we tried to buy a house on 25th Street in Monte Vista, and we moved in, very happy to move in, and then a delegation of the neighbors came in and they informed us that we could live there, that it was a no-no.
There were virtually no civil rights laws. One's ability to gain entry to establishments such as restaurants was very much subject to a proprietor's whims.
2 of us went to the front door and tried to get in and order a hamburger, but they said no, you can't buy a hamburger. You'll have to go to the alley, go to the kitchen, and the chef will be very happy to serve you whatever you want. And there's nothing else to do. We wanted a hamburger, so we went and bought our hamburgers, and we had to eat our hamburger right out in the alley.
There were theaters like the Ramona in Phoenix that sometimes featured Spanish-language movies. But gaining admission to the theaters showing Hollywood's finest was a hit-and-miss proposition. State Senator Manual Pena remembers an incident as late as the 1960s.
It said, no, we don't have any room, it's full. And so my kids and everybody disappointed. We stood on in the sidewalk, and a guy came out, a white guy in a family. And boom, we bought a ticket and went in. So I went up and asked the gal and said, you told me this place was full, yet you let those people go in. I want to go in. I've got a pass or I'll pay for it. And she said, I'm sorry, it's full. And the next guy that came in to buy a ticket, I didn't let him buy it. I just said, hey, place is full. You can't buy a ticket. So they run us off.
Hollywood's best efforts seldom provided positive Hispanic images, as with this, the most infamous Hispanic stereotyping scene in movie history.
Badges? We ain't got no badges. We don't need no badges. I don't have to show you any stinking badges.
The journalistic treatment of Mexican Americans was, in early days, no different from that of other minorities. Positive stories seldom appeared, attacks against Hispanics were seldom reported, crimes by Hispanics made the news. As early as 1878, Carlos Velasco founded in Tucson El Fronteriza, a Spanish-language paper that engaged in editorial battles against the English-language Arizona Star. Today, the most prominent such paper is El Sol, issued in Phoenix. Currently published by Ray Flores, it was founded more than 50 years ago by Jesus and Josefina Franco. Public swimming pools in Arizona have always been a matter of summer survival. Former Governor Raul Castro remembers an early experience.
No, I grew up in the Douglas, Arizona area, and I was rather active in high school activities. And one day we were meeting at the YMCA, and I started going and swim with the rest of the kids. And as I started going to the swimming pool, the man at the desk says, Castro, you can't go in. You can't go in swimming in the pool. Why not? He said, we don't let Mexican kids swim until on Saturdays when the water's cleaned out and water's dirty. And to me, that was a disaster area. I thought that was terrible to get that type of treatment.
We couldn't go swimming at the Riverside Pool on South Central because there were signs up there, no Mexicans, blacks, or dogs. It said no Mexican niggers or dogs allowed.
Segregation sometimes was found in churches as well. In Phoenix in the 1920s, members of Ray Flores' family contributed both money and labor to build St. Mary's Church.
As it turned out, they weren't allowed to go upstairs to the Mass. They had to go downstairs into the kind of basement area where they served Mass for the Mexican Americans. Later on, their daughter tried to get into St. Mary's High School, and they wouldn't accept her because her parents were of Mexican background.
He told us, go down to the basement. And then we felt slighted because we could see the Anglo boys and girls going up to the entrance of St. Mary's, which was very nice. And the nuns were up there waiting for them, and they would usher them into the church. And the services lasted quite some time. In the meantime, we were down in the basement. And when the services were over, upstairs, the bishop came down and quickly, without much fanfare, he gave us our first Holy Communion.
Until 1954, Arizona law allowed black children to be placed in segregated schools. Mexican American children were not legally separated, although housing patterns created the same effect. In some classrooms, Anglo and Hispanic kids were seated only in different rows, and there were certain taboos. Frances Amabisca, a retired school superintendent, remembers her classroom teaching experience.
Children came to first grade of school, and they were not supposed to speak Spanish. They were supposed to start speaking English immediately. They did not know a word of English, so in order for them to understand me, I had to speak in Spanish, and it was against the school rules and against the state law.
You spoke Spanish anyway to them.
I had to, because otherwise they did not understand me.
What were the consequences if you got caught?
I was reprimanded by the superintendent because they were supposed to be total immersion.
And the hiring of Hispanics as teachers required the breaking of some barriers. Ray Flores in 1950 was the first person applying as a Mexican American to be hired to teach in the Phoenix Union High School district. Some other Mexican Americans taught in the district but claimed different nationalities.
Mary Gomez came from Casa Grande in Arizona. Rita Canal came from Juarez, across the border from El Paso. And Rose Plummer came from New Mexico. She was Rose Gonzalez.
They were French Canadian.
But we had an inside joke in those days, and they still have. Mexicans who were working in a white-collar job or a mid-level job, we either said they were working Italians or working French Canadians. So.
Ironically, Ray Flores' first several years with the district were spent teaching at the segregated, all-black Carver High School. During the Depression, when 11% of Arizona's Anglos were on relief, 59% of the state's Mexican Americans were out of work. But even when times were better, Hispanics were usually kept out of the better jobs.
when the Lures building opened, you know why I was able to find a job there as an elevator operator. I worked there as an elevator operator with George Lures. The Lures building opened in 1925, and I was one of the first elevator boys. And but anybody else, just labor, just to pick and shovel, building the streets and the new buildings that were being built at that time. Nothing else.
When you hear answers like, we don't hire Mexicans, and one gentleman told me he not only didn't hire Mexicans, he didn't hire, and he used the word niggers for Negroes or blacks, and he said, and I don't even hire Jews. That was a shocker, because I knew that in his family history, they came from a Jewish family.
Most historians would agree that the most significant event of the 20th century was World War II, and Mexican Americans played a significant role.
37 Mexican Americans won the Congressional Medal of Honor in World War II. That's an amazingly high number. Arizona's only Medal of Honor winner in World War II was Sylvester Herrera, Mexican American. So we have a rich, proud heritage as warriors, as citizens, as Americans defending America's freedom.
Just as the war had changed so much of the world, the post-war period saw changes in the attitudes of those Mexican Americans who had served in it.
For example, the segregation in the swimming pools, the limiting of dances to one night for Hispanics, or as they said, Spanish night type thing. And in the schools, the segregation in the schools. It went on into the churches and other social agencies, city governments, etc. So those of us that came back from World War II had that burning desire to change things for ourselves and for future generations, because we'd had enough of that.
Though still limited, there were the beginnings of a new political involvement. In 1950 in Phoenix, Adam Diaz was the first Mexican American ever elected to the Phoenix City Council as part of the nonpartisan charter government ticket. The first two-thirds of the 20th century did not give Hispanic Arizonans very much toward the fulfillment of the American dream. But changes were coming. In the 1960s, as America was swept with the movement for civil rights, most eloquently represented by Dr. Martin Luther King. But for a new generation of Mexican Americans, who often preferred the descriptive term Chicano or Chicana, a great deal of inspiration came from an unassuming, soft-spoken leader, Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers.
He was very likable. His integrity would be unreproached. He had something in mind to do, and he was going to do it in the best way that he could.
And so he was a transcendental figure, one that took in demographically a relatively small cause and made it all of our cause. Perhaps the single most inspirational figure of that era.
Certainly, young Chicano activists joined in the efforts to raise the nation's consciousness and bring about national and state legislation to guarantee equal opportunity and access to public accommodations. But some actions, though still very important, were more local in nature. In the small community of Guadalupe, the fight for something as basic as mail service was organized by young school teacher and later Maricopa County Supervisor Ed Pastor.
There was not a mailbox in Guadalupe, and the U.S. Post Office was delivering mail to a grocery store. The grocer knew when the checks were coming in, and he would get his cut from the groceries or for credit he had given, and then he would give the change to the residents, which was a bad idea.
When it was learned that Arizona State University did business with a laundry that discriminated against Chicano employees, student Alfredo Gutierrez, who would later be a state senator, led a peaceful and successful protest.
And so it was necessary for students on a bicultural basis and a multicultural basis to make it clear to the administration that discrimination in 1967 in the United States of America was no longer acceptable, something that the administration did not understand.
In 1969, Phoenix Union High School was a focal point. Parents and students complained that Hispanics were arbitrarily being steered to vocational education. Campus security was laxed, the dropout rate was high, and the facilities were falling into disrepair. When the school board would take no substantive action, the student body went out on a strike, organized in part by present-day State Representative Joe Eddie Lopez.
It lasted for about a period of a month in total. We're talking about 2/3 of the student body population at Phoenix Union High School, and then some of the students at Carl Hayden, 200-300, and Carl Hayden joined, and then some of the students at South Mountain.
Ironically, today, Representative Lopez is also a member of the Phoenix Union High School District Governing Board that he helped organize the strike against. If there was one single event that served as a positive indication of what was possible to achieve, it was the election in 1974 of Raul Castro as governor of the state of Arizona. Born in Mexico in poverty as one of 13 children, became a naturalized citizen, worked his way through college and law school, won election as county attorney and Superior Court judge, twice selected as a U.S. ambassador, and elected governor.
I had a great sense of pride, really, of my heritage, and a great sense of pride that in Arizona this could be accomplished and could be done. I had been probably the first county attorney in Arizona, the first Superior Court judge, I believe, and certainly the first governor, and the first ambassador from Arizona of Hispanic heritage. So it gave me a great sense of responsibility. In other words, the standard was higher for me than somebody else. If somebody goes off, okay. But if Raul Castro creates some damage somewhere down the line, then the standard was a little higher for me. So the responsibility was there.
Phoenix has always had less of an Hispanic atmosphere than Tucson. In recent years, historians have discovered that wasn't entirely by chance. Apparently, in the 1870s, some of the founding fathers felt that Arizona had enough Mexican Americans down in Tucson. Phoenix, they felt, ought to be some kind of a white man's enclave. There are stories of Hispanic families being told in no uncertain terms to settle elsewhere, to move on. Ignoring the warning could get you hurt or killed. It's not a happy story nor a proud legacy, but knowing about such intolerance should make us appreciate the struggle, the sacrifice, and the risk people have taken in pursuit of the promise of America.
When you think of Hispanic art, what may come to mind are the huge Chicano murals often adorning buildings or freeways. In fact, some remarkable artists have been involved with the Chicano mural movement. This bold, often politically oriented expression appears on canvas as well. It's art that comes alive with the use of vivid color, or humor, or satire. Its themes often draw on a deep-rooted Chicano pride filled with the history of struggle and strife. In art, the bittersweet experience of the Chicano is depicted, often bearing the very soul of the artista.
Whatever the career goal, there are examples of success stories to offer inspiration. But in a very competitive world, inspiration alone isn't enough. Success requires preparation, training, hard work, and self-confidence. In this final segment of A Second Look, we went back to all of the people we'd spoken with and asked them to share their thoughts on Arizona's Hispanic heritage, on the progress that's been made, and on what is needed today and tomorrow.
I had the question yesterday asked of a young girl who was applying for a job. Oh, you've got a master's. I didn't know Mexicans had a master's degree. The girl answered, I had to have a master's in order to get my doctorates. That to me is where the key is, having self-confidence. And children who come to first grade have to be helped to gain self-confidence. At home, by you, by me, by everybody around them.
The image of second-class consideration still exists in the minds of the parents, is reinforced in the minds of the youngsters. They receive treatment in the schools and in the judicial system and everything else that imposes on them this feeling that, hey, we're still not first class, or we're still not top of the heap or whatever.
But textbooks, of course, do not talk about those kinds of contributions. Things have changed. Textbooks now are talking about the contributions of all groups, of all minorities, racial or ethnic minorities, and they're beginning to talk about the contributions of Mexican Americans.
And I still think that even today there is a strain of discrimination, of prejudice, and we still have to work on that. Until we overcome that, we will always be one step behind.
I warn them that they're going to be facing, the problems of discrimination in some way or other, and that they need to set them aside.
Unlike any other immigrant group, we're still immigrating, so that the stresses that might have been resolved in, say, the Italian community or the Irish community in 1 or 2 generations will not be resolved in our community, because they are being replenished again and again and again. And so in our case, vigilance is required. Vigilance is demanded.
I would point out to them that they should be very proud of their heritage. The Aztec culture is beautiful, and there is nothing to be ashamed of. Being a Mexican American is an honor.
The Mexican American, the Hispanic peoples of Arizona today have a proud heritage. You might say the blood of the conquistadors flows in their veins, and the blood of the early Spanish settlers who came into Arizona and New Mexico. These were not people who came to ravage the land. These were people, the Los Paisanos, they came to settle the land, and they were the agriculture, they farmed, they ranched, they were miners.
There is a glorious ancient Indian civilization to Mexico that the present-day Hispanic should take great pride in addition to the fact that he has the rich culture of Spain, so that in many respects he has the best of the two worlds.
Become a participant. Just don't sit on the sidelines. Be active. Be active politically. Be active in everything. And take out the word don't from your language. Don't let anybody tell you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. The answer is you can do it. Everyone can do it if they make up their mind and do it with the proper background, with intensity.
I would tell them to educate themselves the best way they could, that they were Americans, they were born in this country, or they became residents of the country. They have all the rights that everybody else has.
We are Americans. We have mutual problems, and the remedies are going to be solutions that are going to affect everybody. And we cannot look at a situation, at a remedy for a particular class of people. Almost any remedy that is good for one person is going to be good for everybody.
You begin to realize very quickly that our success is absolutely phenomenal. Part of that has to do with the times. There has been a civil rights movement. There are affirmative action issues. There are an immense number of equal opportunity programs. Nonetheless, it also has to do with the sort of incredibly creative, hardworking spirit of our folk.
I would tell them what I learned as a child, that I am a Mexican by birth. I am an American, very proud of my country, and that we have strong heritage and roots that we can leave to the younger children, and that we need to go to school like all children, and we have to become very productive citizens.
Education, there is no question that is a key to everything. We suffered discrimination, terrible discrimination, because we were not educated. We didn't have the education necessary to cope. And all we need now is for our youngsters to attain higher education. Once they have higher education, there is no limit to what they can do.
I think number one, I think the priorities have changed. It used to be, when I was young, by the time a youngster got to be 15 years of age, the parents would say, go out in the cotton fields, go out and work. Let's put some bread on the table. Now the priorities have changed. Now a parent is saying, go to school, get an education. Education is foremost in every Hispanic's mind as of this day.
What we're showing is a success rate that's so spectacular that would probably exceed every other immigrant group that's come to this country. We have to dwell on that as well. Otherwise, we take the risk of beginning to accept the view that some races have of us, that we're second-class people. We are indeed a very special people, but it isn't a second class at all. It's a spectacular first class.
In this part of the world, in the southwest of the United States, the Spaniards, the Mexicans were here before many other cultures. Mexican Americans have contributed to the development of the state of Arizona, to the southwest. They're contributing today and will contribute in the future. We need to be proud, and people need to recognize our contributions and accept them, and also be proud with us.
I remember as a kid, very little of this history or heritage was taught in our schools. Our image of Mexico was limited to that of border towns like Nogales, the place you went to bargain for jewelry or pottery or to buy tax-free liquor. Or from fiction, certainly there were a few heroic characterizations like Zorro or the Cisco Kid, but their impact was far outweighed by the images of the sidekick, Pancho, or the comic strip character called Gordo, both of whom were portrayed as fat and not very intelligent. It's always easier to reinforce negative stereotypes than to promote a positive role model. The history of the Mexican people and of Mexican Americans has been a battle against bigotry, and today it's more important than ever that this battle be won. In Arizona, almost 1 person in 5 is of Mexican descent. The cultural, social, and political impact will continue to grow with the population. The Republic of Mexico continues to share our southern border. The struggles of the millions of people there will increasingly affect our own future. So it makes good sense, indeed it's critically important, that we have a knowledge and an appreciation of that history and culture. And that's what we've tried to do with this program by taking a second look. I'm Bill McCune. Take care.